My name's Tansy Hoskins, and I'm going to be facilitating the next hour. We've got a big job to do over the next hour, because this is the crisis session, and we've got an hour in which to explain and discuss what's going on. And for me, really, the point of this session in particular is to really bring home to everyone here and to the world, really, that this is not a dress rehearsal. You know, we are the people. If anyone is going to change the world and save the world, it's the people in this room, it's the people watching. And we're going to begin with a crisis. We've got a fantastic panel here. We've got John Broderick, we've got John Hillary, we've got Neil Faulkner, we've got Natalie Bennett from the Green Party, and we've got Liddy Nakpil as well, who will be joining us from the Philippines. But what we also have, our panel isn't just made up of 5-6 people. The panel is also made up of all of you guys, because what we're trying to do at TCE is do things a little bit differently. So we will be bringing you in for questions and for comments. We want this to be a discussion. We want to hear what every single one of you has to say. And I saw the number of questions that went to Naomi, and I know they didn't all get to be, answered. So, put them to these guys as well. Put them to each other. And if you don't feel like putting your hand up or writing, we also have Twitter, we have social media, we have hashtag TCEUK, so you can put a question to the Twitter team and they will bring it down to me. Okay, let's get going. So, first of all, I have a question for John Broderick, who is a scientist at the Tyndall Centre. So, because what we've just been hearing, John, from Naomi Klein is about how serious the climate crisis is. Can you tell us just how much we need to change the way the fossil fuel economy works? And what I think, this is the crisis session, so can we hear a bit more about what the consequences will be if we don't change the way and, we're doing things and reach our targets for reducing carbon emissions?
Okay, I'll not major on the impacts because that's not the area that I work on. I'm a researcher at the Tyndall Centre up in Manchester, and I mainly focus on emissions trajectories and emissions pathways. I don't quite know how I'm going to follow Naomi straight after either. Suffice to say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports are there for all of us. They may not be a very open and public process in their development, but the outcomes very much are. And so I would urge you to go to the IPCC website and take a look at the documents there, where they set out what we have learned over the past 30 years about our climate system. And what we find is that we observe the climate to be changing. We can identify those changes very clearly with human causes, and that we have expectations of what the future will hold, and that the majority of the impacts are not seen to be ones that will be positive for society. And we very much have identified the possibilities of abrupt and non-zero catastrophic change, and we don't know quite when they will come with the extent of warming, but we do know that as warming progresses and we get a greater magnitude of it, we get a greater impact and a greater likelihood of those very catastrophic changes. So the questions that I'm interested in with my colleagues, Professor Kevin Anderson and Dr. Alice Bowes, is about what action should we take, and what do we know about the safe emissions space that's available to us, and how we would share that out. So we know that the extent of climate change is largely dominated by the total quantity of emissions that we put out through time. It's not the amount of emissions in any given year, but the total quantity through time. So timing really does matter in this. And so we can take from our climate models a measure of a total quantity, a carbon budget, and then it's up to us to share that out between different nations and between different periods of time and different technologies. And so in the work that Kevin Anderson and I suppose have done, what we've shown is that if we allow an emissions space for the poorer parts of the world, and we say that their emissions continue to grow to 2025, which really in terms of human development is not a long period of time at all. And then we take out emissions from food production, from cement building infrastructure, and from deforestation, to some extent associated with food production and other demographic change. And we look at what is the safe emission space left that we, the richer members of society would have available to us. And what we find is that we have to make very radical and very substantial changes. So the rate and the extent of change are both significant and not what's on the cards at the moment. And so we would be looking at reductions of about 7% per annum from now until we decarbonise almost entirely. And that means that we need to be talking here in the UK and the EU about 80% reductions by 2030, not the 40% that's on the cards to date.
Okay, John, can you tell us, I mean, what do you see might happen? Can you just give us a few examples if we don't reach the kind of targets you're talking about?
Okay, so what we'll see is very much more energy in the atmosphere, and that would lead us towards greater extent and likelihood of intense rainfall events that can cause flooding and disruption, and heat waves as well that can cause the opposite, that can cause drought events. And then we look at how those sorts of changes might impact on society. And that very much depends on what sort of society and what sort of impact, what sort of infrastructure we have in any given place. And what we tend to see is that existing vulnerabilities and inequalities are amplified when we stress them with these greater impacts due to the greater amount of energy in the climate system.
Okay, thank you, John. Now I've got a question. I've got a question for Natalie Bennett, and then someone gave this great question from the floor. So Natalie, you're going to have two questions. So first of all, I mean, so Natalie's the leader of the Green Party, for those of you who didn't know. We're very pleased that she could join us today. Now, unlike all the other parties, all the other major parties, the Greens do have big plans for reducing carbon emissions along the lines that John just outlined. Now, it is a great plan, and as you can see, it's a very popular plan, not only in this room, but under this parliamentary system, it's likely, you know, after the election, it's likely just still to be a plan on paper. So, and Caroline Lucas, your colleague, has been very vocal about the disconnect between Parliament and the people. Do you feel like we are facing a democratic deficit in this country?
Indeed, very much so. And thank you. It's great to be here, and particularly great to be following Naomi. The democratic deficit, and I really want to pick up and start from somewhere where Naomi went to, which is talking about our problems being structural rather than individual. It's very easy, and indeed it is right, to blame, say, Ian Duncan Smith for the hideous, vicious benefit sanctions that are leaving so many people in absolute poverty. But the problem isn't, you know, despite his individual responsibility, the problem is the system. The problem is we need to tackle that systemic problem. And I was looking this morning at some figures, and Ipsos Mori in January, 16% of Britons trust politicians to tell the truth. 31% trust bankers. I've got a real doubt about the bankers figure, but anyway. But this is a long-standing issue. If you go back to 1983, only 18% of people trusted politicians to tell the truth. So it is really worth, as the question I was asked focused on, looking at the structural problem. We have, particularly in Westminster, a system that hasn't been reformed in nearly 100 years. The last big change in Westminster was women getting the vote. And we're coming up to the centenary of that. And, you know, let's not get to the centenary without changing anything significant after that. And there's a whole list of things there. The unelected House of Lords, the first past the post electoral system that's been such a challenge to the Green Party. But there's so many other problems too. When you walk around Westminster, as I so often do, MPs just don't look like any kind of representative group of British people at all. They're drawn from a tiny section of society, and of course, they're overwhelmingly one gender. And then there's something else which is more perhaps particular to now, which is political funding. And a figure you mightn't know is currently, last year we hit a record level, £70 million of private donations to political parties. And nearly 20% of that came from 20 sources. Naomi was talking about the influence of fossil fuel companies, and I'd add bankers to that. And that's very much the case. So what I want to do here is throw out some ideas rather than necessarily entirely provide answers, but also think about the quality of decision making. Even if you ignore for a second the content of decisions, the way in which, and as an old journalist I know this well, how the minister's had a bad day, so he has a brainwave, writes something down on the back of an envelope, and the decision is announced on the front page of the Times the next morning the government's going to do something. And then all his civil servants sit round and scratch their heads and try and work out how they're going to make it look like the government's doing this. And that's the kind of way we make so many decisions, and that produces things like flip-flops on solar energy policy, all those kind of things that we've seen. And something else, and I think Naomi was talking about the whole silo thing here. We probably don't think about outsourcing as a political issue very much in terms of the politics of how things work. But I'd like to focus for a second particularly on thinking about outsourcing jails, policing, probation, and think about how when we outsource the coercive power of the state, that's profoundly undemocratic. Outsourcing is bad in itself, but as soon as you lose control of that coercive power to the private sector, what's that doing to our democratic control? So we've got all of these issues that I just wanted to throw out there for further discussion. But there's one more thing, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about crisis, but I'm going to end this bit on a positive note, if I'm allowed to do that. Because I think it's very clear that we've had decades of dominance of whether you want to call it neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, whatever it is. But it's clearly bankrupt, even in its own terms. And we often tend to think about political change as happening slowly and gradually. You know, in the Green Party, we've traditionally thought, oh, we work really hard for a couple of years and we get one councillor elected, and another couple of years we get another councillor. But actually, real political change happens in big jumps. And the last big jump was the rise of Thatcherism. We had a sudden change from a whole different political philosophy to Thatcherism, greed is good and the planet is infinite. That change happened. It's now clearly run its course. It's time for our change, which is everyone on this planet should have access to the resources for a decent quality of life. And we all have to collectively do that within the limits of the one planet. And that's our time. That's what we need to do through democratic, economic, social, total change. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, don't go away, don't go away. Thank you, Natalie. Now, whilst I've got Natalie here, I'm going to ask this question which came in from the floor, which is, and I think it's a great question, it says, I think that many, if not most, people lose interest when they hear us going on about saving the environment or saving the planet. They don't hear it as being about us all as people. Do you, or does anyone, have any ideas for a different terminology? I think this is something the Green Party is good at, so...
Yeah, well, I think there is a problem in one of all those surveys you say, you know, what's your top political issue? If you just say environment, what does that mean? It's very amorphous. And that's where we really need to pin it down to the physical realities. Now, I'm going to apologise in advance here because I have to tell you that all of you damaged your lungs just by coming here today. Euston Road has astonishingly high levels of air pollution. You've just walked through it. We need to make people understand that's environment. And then link it up together and say that it's mostly poor people who live on busy roads who are consistently exposed to the worst levels of air pollution. The social and the environmental justice go together. And we also need to appeal to the kind of softer emotions. Now, some of you might have noticed I've got into a lot of trouble for talking about hedgehogs. I do talk about hedgehogs. People feel warm feelings about hedgehogs. But let's think about this in a broader sense. And I think this is a figure that really make sure any of your friends, your colleagues, your family know about. Because it's a figure from the World Wildlife Fund. And everyone should know about this figure. In the last 40 years, that's less than my lifetime, the last 40 years, the world has lost 50% of its wildlife. There are 50% fewer vertebrate wildlife animals in the world now than there were 40 years ago. And if you want a single measure of how we're trashing the planet, and I don't think you'd find too many people who would say, oh, I'm not concerned about that, doesn't worry me. Make it real, make it concrete, make it relate to people's lives, and make it relate to social justice as well.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, let's see. I mean, does anyone else out there have any specific questions for Natalie or for John Broderick? We've got some roving mics going around. It'd be great to hear from someone. Got somebody here. I'll take a couple.
Hi, check. Is that working? Yeah. I kind of sort of asked this on Twitter already, but I was really excited by what Naomi said about stepping out of our silos. And I'm wondering if Natalie and Russell Brand are planning on talking and stepping out of your silos, because I feel like there's sometimes opposing messages, and I want to see where there's a common ground.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more. Can we get a mic here? Oh, 1 second.
Yeah, Martin from the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign. I'm so excited that Naomi Klein mentioned our campaign. My question really is to Natalie. It's about the hope that we can offer. I suppose it's twofold, because when I talk about climate, I always try and say there are, 3,000 pensioners who will die this winter because they're freezing to death because they can't heat their homes. We've got unemployed apprentices where I live, unemployed young people in Salford who can't have jobs. Why not match the two up, reduce emissions, insulate their homes and keep pensioners alive? What's the barrier to doing this? And I suppose what I'd like Natalie to be able to say here is, do you think we as a movement can give that hope, can use that megaphone that Naomi Klein offered, and particularly I think in the run-up to Paris when climate will be on the agenda for everyone. And I'd like to see all the panel and all the people in this room calling out for big demonstrations and protests in December in London and in Paris, not simply for the sake of demonstrations, but to offer that hope to the population over the next few months that we can do something to change the world and make it better.
Thank you. Who's got a question for John? We've got one of Britain's leading climate scientists right here in this room. We've got to have a question for him. Was your question for him, for John?
My question's for all of you.
Okay.
And it sort of relates to what Natalie said about the MPs being all white and male and middle class. But look around you in this room, it's all white and male and middle class. Predominantly, not male, but it's white and male middle class predominantly. The climate movement's very similar as well. So what we're going to do is include the Black Asian, LGBT. Look, this is an important issue. It's not male, I'm talking about the MPs, as Natalie said, that system is very white and male. The climate movement's very middle class and white. That's the reality. Look around, there's probably about 6 or 7 black people here and a few Asians as well. What about the LGBT community as well? How are we going to involve us all? How are you going to actively engage and make it more diverse? Because it's our ancestral countries, my parents are from Ghana, it's our ancestral countries that are being affected and will be affected most by the impacts of this catastrophic change.
Okay. Okay, so yes, some important questions being raised. I mean, we will be also on this panel, but who couldn't be here, is Liddy, who is a speaker from the Philippines and one of the leading climate justice people from the Global South. And we will also be hearing from other people from the Global South over Skype, people who we can't get here. But it is an important question. You know, how do you make this global issue count for everyone? Who has a question for John? And then I'm going to bring some more people back. It'd be nice to have some more women putting their hands up. Maybe have some questions there. Here?
600 years before the car, Greenland was warm and green
Who's
in the
that?
medieval warm period. Now, after a few centuries of carbon emissions, the world is actually getting cooler because the sun is going into a lap.
This is a
The
question.
20th century was hot because the sun was active. The sun drives climate.
Can I
Okay.
respond?
Greenhouse effect campaign and carbon taxes drive fuel poverty, which hurt the old and the poor.
Okay, can I
Wait.
respond? May I?
Yeah. Yeah. John.
I'm going to respond by first rejecting you, Tansy. I'm not one of the world's leading climate scientists, and nor should you listen to any individual leading climate scientist or any individual voice on this topic. Okay? What?
Oh well.
what we have in the institution of science is a process of developing greater knowledge about our world, and that proceeds collectively. That's not something that's associated with an individual. So rather than listen to an individual, I would urge you to look at the collective process of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change and the findings that they have reported to us. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, John. Natalie, I'm going to bring you back in.
Well, first of all, I'm going to pick up on one point of disagreement and then really try and pull some of those questions together. Russell Brand and the Green Party have many, many points of agreement. But I do want to stress one strong point of disagreement, which is he says roughly don't vote, it only encourages them. I entirely disagree with that statement. The fact is that if you don't vote, if you don't register to vote, you get counted in the I'm happy enough with how things are that I haven't bothered. That's what that gets counted as. So please, everyone, if you're tweeting now, tweet a register to vote message. The deadline's April 20, but let's do it today and make sure everyone knows they have to register to vote and are registered to vote. That's a really important message to get out of today, which is kind of joined up. And I think that's several of those questions in different kind of ways address that need to join things up. Now I'm going to pick up, I was talking about political reform and political change. Is there anyone here today from the Electoral Reform Society? I thought the answer to that was going to be no, and that's making a point, because electoral reform is a climate change issue. And that's how we need to join all of this up together. And taking up the point about the million climate jobs, that's a critical part of joining up the social justice and the environmental justice. And it's one of the things that we have to really fight and get across, that an economy, a society that's living within our environmental limits must be a much better society for everyone, but particularly the poor and the disadvantaged. And we have to get that message across. And that means, that's why, I spend a lot of time on telly and whatnot talking about a living wage. If everyone has a living wage, that means they can afford to pay their bills. That covers whatever the costs of your renewable energy might be. We have to bring this all together collectively. It's not the silos. I think Naomi's absolutely right. We've got to join up all these movements together. And I think today is a great start, but there's so much more to do to make sure everyone's talking to each other and working together, including Russell Brand.
Thank you, Natalie. Right, time is on the floor for this bit of the session.
Okay, so this is sort of in response to the people that were shouting, to the climate scientists, John Broderick, and Natalie. I'd like to ask how you think we can make this more accessible to a wider demographic of people. For instance, recently I read an article about how the Gulf Stream is massively changing due to the change in salinity, the Greenland ice cap melting. And so, yes, okay, in one very specific region of the world, the UK, cooling is happening, and not just cooling, but a coming ice age, basically, because of the change in the Gulf Stream, which is directly linked to climate change. It's not just warming, it's an overall thing. And I'd like to ask how you want to make issues like that more accessible to people across the world, because I think what we've seen today is that education isn't working, and that more people need to know about these issues, and that, so yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I'll go first and you can go second on that one. I think one of the things we have to look at is, you think it's actually quite amazing that consistently surveys have shown that 75% plus of the British people basically believe in human-caused climate change. And given their exposure to the right-wing media, to the total nonsense that's published in a lot of the mass press, that's actually a really good argument for the common sense of the public, actually. It's quite amazing that people have stood up against so much propaganda from the other side. But what we have to do is, and this is where it's a real challenge of politics, is to put this in language that is accessible, and that's really important. And we're talking about silos and joined upness. Another issue that I doubt they're here today, but the media ownership reform. the Media Reform Coalition should also be here, and we should be talking to them as well, because if people are going to get decent information, they need decent information sources. But let's make sure, you know, and I think we can probably, everyone in this room has been guilty of this, and I'll certainly confess it myself. When you write a leaflet, don't write it for yourself. Write it so that it's going to be accessible to everybody. And when you're talking about these things, do your absolute best to talk about it in really accessible ways. Make sure you've boiled it down and got a simple, clear message, because that's what we need to get out.
Thank you, Natalie. Now, part of what we're trying to do here at This Changes Everything is to bring a lot of these issues together. You know, it's about kind of joining the dots. So I want to bring in John Hillary, who's the Executive Director of the War on Want campaign. Because, John, what I feel like we're dealing with here is not only climate change, climate crisis, but also an economic crisis, also rising inequality, and also what seems to me over the last sort of 10 years, sort of perpetual war. So my question for you is, how can fighting for climate justice also help tackle the war, the poverty and the inequality that we're experiencing?
Thanks, Tansin. It's really brilliant to be here to see such an amazingly full room. So I think the first thing to do is start with a massive round of applause for all the people who've come and filled Friends House in its biggest room. And I actually think this connection between the climate crisis, the crisis of capitalism around the world, and the crisis of perpetual permanent war is actually something which is bringing us out of our silos more and more. And I've got some really nice examples which sort of pop into my head on that all the time. But that crisis, that triple crisis of violence, of capitalism, and of climate crisis, goes back right the way to the 1970s, when there was a call for system change. Internationally, in the global capitalist system, there was a call for what was then termed the new international economic order. And that call came up from the global south, and it was resisted by the core capitalist states, which were facing a crisis of oil, and they resisted it by forming the G7, the group of the 7 most powerful core capitalist states. And in their first communique, they said absolutely clearly, we will secure for our economies the natural resources, the energy resources they need by any means necessary. And they said that, and they meant it. And what they meant is not just that we're going to get all of the fossil fuels out of the ground, we're going to get those fossil fuels out of the ground for us. And it's going to be Western oil companies, Western mining companies, Western gas companies, for capitalism in the West to be able to prosper into the eternal future. And you don't need me to tell you what that led to. In 2003, we went to war in Iraq precisely for oil. And the last 2 times we had Naomi actually physically in this room were to talk about the capitalism which had led to war in Iraq. It has also led to a situation where the US currently has a standing policy that it should be able to intervene militarily around the world at any time to secure the energy resources it needs for the US capitalist system to survive and prosper. This is a standing thing. They call it the anti-access forces. You don't even understand what it means until you read further. Must be destroyed by US military power, i.e. any country which is trying to stop the West from getting into their country to get the oil, the gas and whatever, has to be pushed away. So when we think about the Paris COP at the end of this year and building this mass momentum towards it, we need also to be aware that there are very strong forces in other fields going in completely other directions. And particularly for us, capital is currently trying to rewrite the rules of the global economy in its favor more and more. You'd think to yourself, more in its favor? What more does it possibly want? What could it have which is more in its favor? But there is a system of rules and new commercial treaties being negotiated around the world which are explicitly designed to do that, to further the interests of capitalism, and also to prepare for new wars. One of the ones which we're campaigning on particularly at the moment, which is at the forefront of our consciousness here in Europe, is TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which many of you will know is going to be, again, a massive transfer of power away from our societies to capital to be able to operate without any restrictions around the world. But it's explicitly also designed to lock in dependency on fossil fuels for the next 50 years. They're asking for a specific chapter in TTIP, which will mean that shale gas exports from the States and oil exports from the tar sands of Canada will be made to come over to Europe for decades to come. Why are they doing that? Not just because they want to have cheap gas and oil, but also explicitly because they want to isolate Russia. They've said this absolutely clearly. We want to try and break the dependency of some of the European states on Russian oil and gas by opening up the taps from the USA. And they are saying again explicitly, TTIP, these commercial rules, will form an economic NATO to isolate Russia, to be able to reignite the Cold War. Was it so great that we want to start it again? But I am going to finish it also on a message of hope here. I was in a wonderful meeting up in Doncaster a couple of weeks ago, and it was very much an old left meeting, an old meeting of trade unions, and you know, a lot of stuff was reliving the 1980s about how much people hated Thatcher. And this is what you do on the left for a bit, you know, it's therapy. And one of the guys said, you know, he said, when Thatcher was in power, I used to set my alarm clock every morning an hour earlier, so I'd have that extra bit of time during the day to hate her just a bit more. But, even with all of that, that meeting, even though it was old Labour movement stuff, it started with a 10-minute presentation on the local movement against fracking. Now that's new. You would never have had that 20 years ago. That idea that the movement against fracking, the movement for climate justice, is also a movement for systemic change, that it links with the anti-capitalist movement. I'm also on the organising committee of the People's Assembly against austerity, which again, even though it's focused on fighting back against the cuts in this country, is also absolutely clear that it's fighting for system change from the perspective of climate, and was also present in the march on the 7th, just earlier this month. And there will be another march on the 20th of June from the People's Assembly. There will also be days of action against TTIP, which I know are going to be rolled into this proposal to have rolling days of dissent. This is what's building a movement which is challenging all of these crises together, and that's what gives me hope. The fact that it's a red movement, a green movement, a black movement, and all of the different shades, and that's why we're going to win. Thank you.
Thank you. Assad, Daniel, how are we doing with Liddy? We've got her. Okay. Is she coming up? Okay, we have a very... Oh. Video first. Okay, so what's going to happen now is we're going to go live to the Philippines, almost. I want to introduce Liddy Nakpil, who we're really, really pleased is going to join us in some format very soon. She is a leading climate activist in the Philippines. She is part of the Philippines Movement for Climate Justice, and she's part of a central movement out of the Global South, which is the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And I think we're first going to watch a brief film about the typhoons in the Philippines. Is that right, Assad? Yes. Okay, so what I've just heard is that Liddy is on the ground in Philippines, and she's in a bit of a remote area where we can't get enough Wi-Fi for her to do Skype. So what she's done is send over this pre-recorded message for This Changes Everything UK just now.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at your gathering today. I'm sorry I cannot be there, and apologies too that I will not be able to interact with you as our internet is very weak today. I am Liddy Napil. I guess I probably have been introduced. I'm with the coordinating team of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. I'm also coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Death and Development and convener of the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. I am from the Philippines. The Philippines is a country of almost 100 million people, of more than 7,000 islands, and the last few years gaining international public attention as one of the frontline countries affected by the climate crisis. For us, climate change is not about threats and impacts in the future. We are suffering its horrifying effects now in the form of super typhoons that are growing stronger and more frequent in the last few years. We are a country visited by typhoons at the average of almost 20 a year, and that has been the reality of our people for the last hundreds of years. But the typhoons we have been experiencing are the kind that have broken all records, not just the Philippines, but of the whole world for all time. The best example is Typhoon Haiyan, which visited us in November 2013, just as the international climate talks was going on, or had just started. And Typhoon Haiyan was said to be, is still the strongest typhoon to ever hit landfall in all of recorded human history. The toll on us was huge. I don't know if you've seen the photos and the video clips that were shown during that time, but at the end of it all, the toll was more than 13 million people affected, 3 million people displaced, almost 500,000 homes destroyed, almost 2,000 school buildings were also destroyed, and more than 130,000 hectares of crops from which people live, have their livelihoods, and crops for food were also destroyed, and this land will take several years for the crops to recover. So Typhoon Haiyan is not a very unique occurrence, unique perhaps only in its strength, but we have been visited by typhoons of this kind for the last several years, as I said, more frequently and even growing stronger. I have been an activist for more than 30 years, starting with our fight against the dictatorship to bring down the dictatorship in the 1980s. And I must say that I find the struggle against climate change as the most challenging and the most urgent fight I have ever been involved in. The stakes are enormous, no less than the lives of all people and the entire planet. What we need to do in order to win this fight is also no less than transforming the system profoundly, not just in our own countries, but worldwide. And we cannot win without a global movement powerful enough and determined enough to go against the forces who oppose this change. And on top of it all, we have a small window of time in order to do this, and this window is fast closing. In order to win, we must join this fight and build this movement together. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you to Liddy, and I think it would be nice if we could kind of collectively agree to send a message of solidarity from This Changes Everything UK to the Philippines Movement for Climate Justice. What do you think? Okay. I'm just, for 2 minutes, I want to bring in Asad Raymond from Friends of the Earth, who has been working with Liddy in the Philippines and on the movement for climate justice in the Global South. Asad.
I actually wanted to come back to the brother's question over there, because I think it's absolutely a correct question, and it's something we need to address. You know, the environment movement, absolutely, is overwhelmingly white and middle class. And if we want to build power, we have to engage everybody. We have to engage there. If we want to build movements of movements, we have to engage and connect with where the struggles of black people are. And that is a real challenge for some environmental groups, because what it means is, who are you accountable to? It means being accountable not to people here in the north, it means being accountable to people in the global south. Because when we talk about pragmatic politics and what's realistic in British politics, we're talking about the lives of people in the global south. We're talking about decisions that are made here that affect millions and millions of people. So if we want to be truly global and relevant, we have to articulate those demands and we have to stand in solidarity. It also means that as an environment movement, you can't just say, oh, black people, please come to us. We have to actually go to where people's struggles are. That means going in, like in the United States. It means going like in the United States and saying we're standing in solidarity with the protesters in Ferguson. We're standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And this isn't a push for Friends of the Earth, but I have to say, of all the environment movements, I'm glad to see changes now happening at Friends of the Earth. We were on the anti-racist demonstration last week. That's a big move. That's a big change. Environment movement needs to be on those issues. We need to be in the housing fight, because that's where our communities are fighting around social cleansing and ethnic cleansing. So, brother, absolutely, that is one of the things we need to do in these discussions, in the workshops that we'll have this afternoon about movement and vision. I hope that that's brought in, because we need to be a truly global movement, but rooted in local struggles, and that is diverse and has got strength, so we cannot be ignored. Thanks.
Okay, now I just want to bring in our final contributor, who is Marxist historian Neil Faulkner. Neil wrote a very good book called The Marxist History of the World, which is one of my favourite reads. So you should get it. It's probably on the bookstore outside. But I want to bring Neil in because I think today is all about getting as well as a global sense of the crisis, is getting a systemic sense of the crisis. And in your work, I know that you've written a lot about how destructive growth is part and parcel of capitalism. And I think you've said that steady state capitalism doesn't exist. And you've also said that we need revolutionary change in order to fix the mess that we're in. So I'd like you to unpick those 3 points. First of all, what is steady state capitalism? Why is destructive growth part and parcel of capitalism? And why should everybody in this hall become a revolutionary in order to change things?
Okay, that's a tall order in 5 minutes. Let me start by saying this. There's no such thing as steady state capitalism. That's the first thing to say, and I'm going to explain why. And in saying it, I'm also going to pick up something that Naomi said. She said very clearly that we do not have a common cause. And she was talking about not having a common cause with the 1%. We do not have a common cause with the 1%, because they are committed to a system that is destroying the planet, because there is no such thing as steady state capitalism. And I want to explain why I think that is. In fact, I want to make 3 points about the crisis. The first is this. It's all joined up. Naomi was talking about this, others are talking about, John was talking about it just now. It's all joined up. There is a carbon machine, a fossil fuel economy that is pumping pollution into the atmosphere and warming up the planet. There is a war machine of arms manufacturers and militarized states and empires in confrontation with each other, and an international order that's being torn apart by that. There's a profit machine that is driving down wages here and is opening sweatshops in other parts of the world, that is privatizing our public services, that is taking over our social housing, that is taking over our healthcare system. There's a profit machine that is doing all of that. And it's all wired to the same motor, to the same engine. The carbon machine and the war machine and the profit machine is all wired to the same engine. That's the first thing. It's all joined up. And here's the second thing. The reason why you can't have steady-state capitalism is this. No capitalist, no bank, no corporation, no giant privatized conglomerate buying up our public services invests in anything, buys anything, unless they expect to make a profit. They always expect to get more out than they put in. That means, hardwired into the way capitalism works, is unplanned, uncontrolled, unending growth. To stop growth, to rework the global economy to make it sustainable, means getting rid of capitalism, because capitalism is a growth-based system. It is a system of expansion. And here's the third point I want to make about the crisis. What drives that growth is the competition between different corporations, different banks, different groups of people trying to make a profit, different militarized states, different imperial systems, all competing for raw materials, all competing for contracts, all competing for investment opportunities, all competing with each other, and when they don't get their way through economic competition, then resorting to the gun, which is why the international order is being torn apart. It's a system, a single unified system that works in this way, giving rise to a single unified crisis. And what that means for us is this. If we carry on fighting, one single issue campaign at a time, one little protest at a time, we will go down to defeat again and again and again, because there are massive concentrations of economic and political power which we have to confront. And this is the challenge for everybody here today. We have to build a mass, global, joined up, democratic, bottom-up, mass movement to confront that system. And it's just possible. It's just possible that everybody in this room today is going to be present at the beginning of that process of creating that kind of movement. A movement for total system change, a movement for revolutionary change, a movement to overthrow the 1% and the banks and the corporations and to put power in the hands of the people, because that's the historic task facing humanity in the next generation.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Neil. I mean, you seriously, you don't get someone like Naomi Klein saying that this conference is the most exciting thing's ever happened to her in her writer's life without there being a very good reason for that. And everyone who's been involved in the organisation of This Changes Everything is hoping that this is what today will be, the start of something new. And it's particularly important that all of you attend the workshops which are going to be happening. They're a big chunk of the day. And what you'll need to do in order to get into one of those workshops is have one of the brochures. And if you haven't got one of the brochures, can someone hold, hang on, it looks like this. If you haven't got one of these, you need to grab it, and it will have a coloured stamp in the middle there, and that will tell you which room you're going to. And you can get them from the entrance, so make sure you do that before the workshop, because the workshops are where we will be planning this future, of which Neil speaks and of which we're all reliant on, frankly. I'd like to see if there's any questions or comments from the audience. I particularly want things on, it's kind of the next step, on the global issues, the systemic issues. Katia there, is there a microphone near you? Okay. I want to, yeah, Katia.
The so-called housing
crisis that we're supposed to be facing, which I don't think is kind of a term that's a bit misapplied really. It's not so much a crisis of the lack of housing, but really a crisis of genuinely kind of affordable housing, when you're seeing kind of soaring rents, eviction rates, destruction of community. And I think the thing about housing in London is that it really sheds light on the true nature of class division, I think, in London. If you look at who's being forced out of the city, if you look at the destruction of social housing, of working class communities, it's kind of like it's something very ideological in motion. And London in the future, if we don't, it's something, doesn't change very rapidly, is a London that's going to be for the super rich, a London of gated communities, a kind of ghetto for the super rich only. And I think that's why the housing movement is so important, because at the same time the housing movement articulates something about class. You talk about the slogan, social housing, not social cleansing. And I think the processes that is kind of, in a way, tearing people apart in the neoliberal city, if you like, it's kind of one of the strange things. There are these processes that are pulling people apart, pulling communities apart in a really vicious way. But at the same time, these processes are kind of pulling people and bringing people together. Because what we've seen in the last a year, 6 months, is kind of communities really coming together and fighting back around housing and taking radical direct action to kind of fight back on estates. You saw that with the Focus C15 campaign a few months ago. You're seeing that at the moment in Sweets Way with an estate in Barnet that's been under occupation for the last few weeks. That's an estate that's home to 150 families. And I think that's why really that housing as a struggle is absolutely central to our movement for social justice.
Thank you, Katia.
We saw it in Spain with Podemos, with the anti-eviction movement, and I think we need to link up these radical grassroots campaigning around housing and bring them together in assemblies, but also link them up with a wider movement around social justice.
Thank you, Katia.
Back to another point, but I just wanted to talk about what you can do as a woman in the environmental movement. I was ever so pleased that we were opening with a woman speaker. We have female facilitators. One of the practical things you can do if you organise an event is take questions between a man and a woman, just to make sure women have their voices heard, and also selecting women to be on your panels. There's a list, I think, run by a feminist group of experts in all the different fields. But if you are a woman who's active in the climate movement, please put yourself forward for leadership positions, be that in the Green Party or the Transition Town, and then encourage younger women, if they do step forward, just really look after them. One of the things the Green Party has done in terms of their politics, on a democratic basis, they've decided to have positive discrimination on their political list. So there has to be a woman in that top 3 position, the Assembly members. That is how Jenny Jones got elected back in 2000. She's been an absolutely fantastic politician. We've got Natalie here, we've also got Caroline Lucas. So you can do things within your organisation to make sure women feel very supported, and I think that's one practical way we can achieve that.
Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to do now, we're very nearly over time, and there's more sessions going to be happening, and there's more workshops going to be happening. I wanted to see if any of the lead panelists had anything they wanted to add. Natalie?
Okay, well, just very briefly to pick up on the housing point. I mean, there's an enormous amount to say about housing, but it does tie things together nicely, which is the fact that the key problem, our housing crisis, is the fact that we've come to regard homes chiefly as financial assets, not as places for people to live. And that's the key problem. But just very briefly, I wanted to go back again to something Naomi said about the status quo not being an option. We're not going to continue as we are. And I believe the general public actually gets that. If you look at surveys that ask people, do you think your children and grandchildren will have a better life than you've had? People increasingly say no to that question. People are worried. People get in their gut, if not necessarily always having thought through, that this system has failed. We have the joint economic, social, environmental and political crises, and they want that change. But the challenge for us, we've been talking about making sure people understand the problems. We also need to provide really positive, creative solutions. And we've talked about 1 million climate jobs, but I've got a challenge for every artist, creative person, video maker, whatever in this room. What we're really short of is pictures of what a fair, just, within our environmental limits society looks like. Let's paint really positive pictures. Let's present people with all those kind of positive pictures of how we can have a decent, fair society within environmental limits. And I think that I'd like to leave you with that challenge. Let's make sure people understand the problems, but also offer them really positive, hopeful solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. Right, we're going to wrap up the crisis session there. I want to say thank you so much to everybody who was on the lead bit of the panel, and also to everyone who contributed from the floor. You're going to be moving into, there'll be more sessions, there'll be more workshops, and it's really important from this point on that your voices are heard. And just to echo what the comrade here said, it's important that all of you speak. You don't have to, think that you have something specific to say. It's also the act of putting your hand up and saying it, that makes it such a powerful move. So if you've never spoken at an event before, maybe have a think about making today the day when you change that. Make that first step. Well, thank you very much. You've got 10 minutes, and then everybody please be back here. Thank you.